Hey everyone, welcome to video 3 in our Urban Harvest Preservation series. This video is a part of Black Creek Communities Farm's Urban Harvest program, training community leaders to share knowledge about home preservation with other folks in their communities. In this last video today, we're going to be talking about jamming and jellies. This video is going to follow a similar layout to the other two videos. I'm going to chat a little bit about what jams and jellies are here at the beginning, and then we're going to walk through the process of making jams and jellies in my kitchen and chat a little bit about food justice as we do so. Jams and jellies come in so many different varieties and forms and flavors, and they're really specific to certain cultures and traditions, right? Much like pickles, they can be found all over the world in tons of different cultures. Jams and jellies are closely connected to cultural traditional knowledge and is often kind of passed down from generation to generation. Some examples of global jams and jellies would be, Scotch bonnet jelly, which we're making today, calamansi marmalade, eggplant jam, lemon curd, Saskatoon berry jam, the list goes on and on. Like I mentioned, we're going to be making a Scotch bonnet pepper jelly today, as well as kind of a bumbleberry or mixed berry jam. The jam and jelly process are pretty much the same. The only difference really is the consistency in terms of what we end up with. So I'm going to walk you through both of those just so we can see what the differences are. In one of our recipes today, we are going to be using added pectin, whereas in the other one, we're going to be relying on natural pectin found in the fruits and veggies that we're using. Pectin is a natural fiber that we kind of find in the cell walls of different fruits and veggies, and it's often kind of found mostly in the skins of these vegetables and fruits. Pectin in a jam or jelly recipe, what it does, its role is it binds with the sugar in the recipe to really kind of create that thickness that we want and allow our jelly or jam to set. So each jam and jelly recipe, depending on the fruit or the vegetable that you're using, you may or may not need to add extra pectin, or you can rely on the pectin that's naturally present in the vegetable or fruit. There's different fruits and veggies with different levels of pectin that are naturally present. Something like a citrus would have a high level of pectin, so you probably wouldn't need to add pectin, versus something with a lower amount that you might be cooking for less time, like today's Scotch bonnet pepper jelly. You will need to add pectin to make sure that it sets in the way that we want it to. Before we head into the kitchen, I'll just quickly walk you through the jamming process so that we've got a bit of an idea before we go do it in real time. You're going to start, like pickling, with prepping your veggies or fruits that you're going to be using, chopping them up, washing them, all that good stuff. And then with jams and jellies, you're always going to be cooking those veggies or fruits down. So today we're going to be cooking our berries with some sugar and some lemon juice to make that jam, while we're doing our jelly with a nice blend of peppers, as well as some acid, some sugar, and some added pectin. Once you've got your jam cooked down to the consistency you want on the stove, we're going to be filling our jars and processing them just like in the other two videos. In the kitchen, we'll talk a bit more about high versus low pectin fruits and veggies, and I'll also show you some tips and tricks for making sure that we're achieving the consistencies we want with our jams and jellies. Much like with pickles, the ratios of sugar and acid in jams and jellies are super important. Sugar plays a super important role in making jams and jellies because it is a preservative that helps set our jams and jellies and achieve the consistency we want. Both of these recipes do use quite a bit of sugar in order to achieve that consistency. So if you are preferring something with lower sugar amounts, I would suggest checking out the internet as well as cookbooks you might have to find a tried and tested recipe that adjusts for that lower sugar ratio. So without further ado, I think we can head right into the kitchen to get jamming.
So the first thing we're going to do is prep our peppers. For this recipe, we're going to need about 2 cups of chopped up peppers total. So you can use a combination of sweet peppers as well as spicy peppers here. Because I want my jelly to be a bit on the spicier side, I'm going to be using about half a cup of Scotch bonnets and then 1.5 cups of sweet bell peppers. I'm going to start by chopping up my bell peppers. I'm using a combination of different colors just to make it look nice. So I've got some orange, red, and yellow. You can seed and chop these by hand like I'm doing here. Alternatively, you can chop them into big chunks and then throw them into a food processor as well. Chopping by hand will give you a chunkier, kind of more rustic jelly, while using the food processor will give you a finer, smoother one. As you chop your peppers, add them into a large, non-reactive pot. Now we'll move on to our Scotch bonnets. Don't forget to wear gloves while you're chopping these, as they can be quite spicy and we don't want to get any of that in our eyes or on our face. Because I want to minimize the amount of contact I have with the inside of these peppers, I'm just de-stemming them, chopping them into 4 small chunks, and adding them into my food processor, where I'll chop them finely in there. I'm really excited about using these specific peppers because my grandma grew them in her garden over the summer, and I got to freeze them, and now I'm using them for this pepper jelly. Into the food processor they go, where we're going to chop them real nice and fine. Depending on your spice preference, you can include the seeds here or leave them out. So I'm just going to go ahead and add my Scotch bonnets in with the rest of my bell peppers here in my large pot. And we can move on to measuring out the rest of our ingredients. So here I'm measuring out our powdered pectin. I like to use a kitchen scale a lot when I'm canning just to make sure that everything's precise. Here we're looking for 0.875 ounces of pectin. So I've got all of my peppers here ready to go on the stove. A cup of apple cider vinegar. 2.5 cups of white sugar, and the pectin that we just measured. Over a high heat, I'm mixing in my apple cider vinegar as well as my pectin. Now I'm going to bring this to a boil over a high heat, stirring constantly to make sure that we're distributing our pectin and apple cider vinegar evenly. The addition of pectin here will allow us to thicken up our jelly more quickly. If we didn't want to add additional pectin here, we could just cook this mixture down until it sets. The only problem that poses is that it would lead to quite a significant loss of volume in terms of our jelly. So by adding the pectin, we speed the process up and avoid losing any of that good stuff. Once our mixture has come to a rolling boil, we're going to take it off of the heat, and we're going to go ahead and stir in our 2.5 cups of sugar. Once that's all combined, we're going to return it to the heat to bring it to a boil again. Once it comes to a rolling boil, you're going to let it boil full out for between 1 to 5 minutes. This will depend on the size of your pot, how wide it is, and how deep your mixture is. As it boils, you'll see some foam forming at the top. You can just skim that off as soon as we take it off of the heat. When you think that your jelly is ready, you can go ahead and test it. Pop a plate into the freezer for about 15 minutes before you're ready to test your jelly. Using a spoon, drop a dollop of your jelly onto the plate and give it a few minutes to set on the plate. Using your finger, push the jelly. If you see that it starts to wrinkle, as is shown here, then your jelly is set and ready to go. With my jelly off the heat, I'll start to prep my jars for the canning process. Here, I'm washing them all with warm soapy water. This includes the jars, the rims, and the lids. Here, I'm filling my hot water canner and the jars with hot water to get them sterilized on the stove. Gonna simmer both my jars here as well as my lids for 10 minutes. In the meantime, we're gonna get started on our jam. Here, I'm measuring out the berries that I had in my freezer. I've got a mix of blueberries and blackberries here. The easiest way to make a basic fruit jam is by weighing out your ingredients. So I've got about 290 grams of fruit. The weight we want for sugar is about 30% to 50% of the weight of the trimmed fruit. So here I'm going for 145 grams of sugar. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my sugar and berries into a large non-reactive pot and throw in our lemon juice. The rule of thumb here is the juice of 1 lemon for every 1.2 kilograms of fruit. Here I'm using about a quarter of that because I've got about 300 grams of fruit, so I'm using about 1.5 tablespoons of lemon juice, or 1/4 of a lemon. When you're canning, I encourage you to use bottled lemon juice as opposed to a fresh lemon. This may seem a bit counterintuitive, but the benefit of using a bottled juice is that you ensure that the preserves have a consistent level of acidity. Individual fresh lemons might vary in terms of their percentage of acidity, so by using a bottled juice with a consistent level, we ensure that our jams are safe for canning. So here, we're just going to bring this mixture to a boil over high heat. As you can see, I'm kind of mashing up the berries to release those juices with a potato masher, and now I'm lowering the heat to reduce it to a simmer. While our jam simmers, let's head back over to our hot pepper jelly. Here, I'm removing the sterilized jars from the hot water canner with our jar lifters. Next, we'll start filling our jars with our mixture. If it's been a while since you took your jelly off the heat, make sure you reheat the mixture before filling it into the hot jars. As you can see, we're going through the same process as videos 1 and 2, using our funnel and bubble remover to fill each of our jars. Don't forget to wipe down the mouth of your jar with a clean paper towel before adding your lid with your magnetic lid lifter. Here you can watch the same process up close. So I've got a couple of jars of jelly that I'm ready to process in the hot water canner, but I also have a few that I want to store in the fridge for more immediate eating. What I'm doing here is labeling each of these fridge jellies with the date as well as a big, all caps, fridge to make sure that I know it's not shelf stable. And in they go.
So before we get processing our cans, I thought we would pop back in here for a quick kind of food justice for thought moment, making some connections between jamming and making jellies at home and food justice. Like we discussed in earlier videos, home preservation is a really great way to draw connections to the larger food system and to talk about oppression and inequity within that system. As community leaders, you'll be leading these conversations, facilitating these conversations around food justice in the food system. So I just wanted to give y'all some food for thought around food justice and jamming that you might bring with you into your own workshops and sessions. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, jams and jellies are closely connected to culture and to traditional knowledge, and they're passed down within specific cultures from generation to generation. The ingredients in each specific jam or jelly recipe really tell us a story about where the jam originated, as well as give us a bit of insight into where the food comes from, right? So in this way, not only does practicing these types of preservation at home keep traditional knowledge alive within our cultures and within our families, it also serves to kind of reconnect us to the land from which our food comes from. A lot of folks are used to buying jams and jellies at the grocery store rather than making it themselves, which is pretty far removed from the food system, right? So it's pretty easy sometimes to forget that our food comes from land. By practicing and becoming in tune with making jams and jellies, we can begin to learn a bit more about seasonality, changes in weather in local regions, kind of based on the home preservation techniques and practices that come out of these specific places. Looking at when ingredients that we use in jams and jellies when they're grown, when they're harvested, where they're from, and when canning practices traditionally happen, at what time of the year in certain communities. These tidbits of information can really help us draw those connections between food and land and culture that can often kind of get erased as a result of our reliance on the corporate food system. So essentially, by making our own jam at home instead of buying it, not only are we closing this gap between us and our food, but we're actually saving a lot of money too, right? Quote unquote craft preserved foods like jams and jellies and pickles can often be quite expensive, especially if you're looking for stuff that's made with local ingredients. Making jam at home allows us to buy fruits and veggies when they're in season, which means that they're at their cheapest, or to grow them ourselves in community gardens or on urban farms. And then we get to extend the shelf life of them to be able to enjoy them kind of year round, right? Fresh produce can be one of the most inaccessible and unaffordable foods. This is especially true in low-income and BIPOC neighborhoods. In these spaces, fresh produce is often overpriced. Sometimes it's just impossible to find. We can use home preservation as a kind of creative strategy to stretch our budgets around food, to stretch these flavors year-round, kind of like opening up access options this way. So while sharing these strategies, with our communities, doing this kind of knowledge exchange around canning and jamming can be really important and really helpful for managing food insecurity. It's important to kind of also highlight in our conversations that it's not going to solve the root problem. We can't continue to talk about food insecurity without talking about, the systems of poverty and racism that it's really rooted in. Like I said, access to fresh fruits and vegetables is specifically a problem that impacts BIPOC and low-income folks, right? So it's not necessarily an issue just of access, but an issue also of race and racism and of poverty and class. So while it's really important that we continue to have these conversations about home canning, share that knowledge that we have, that cultural knowledge and generational knowledge, it's also crucial that we continue to push for and advocate for changes at that systemic level as well.
So back into the kitchen, we're going to start by processing our hot pepper jellies. We're going to throw these into the hot water canner using our jar lifters and let them process for 5 minutes. Now I'm going to test my jam using the same plate method to see whether it's set. To review, I've got a plate that was in the freezer for 15 minutes. I'm dropping a bit of jam on it, and I'm going to push it with my finger to see if it wrinkles. My jam looks set. I'm pretty happy with it. You test yours using this plate method and find that it's not quite ready. You can always return the jam or jelly to the stove to boil for a few more minutes. Now, this is a pretty small batch of jam because I was just using up what was left in my freezer. So this recipe is only going to fill about 1/2 pint jar. Depending on your personal preferences, you're always able to find small batch and large batch canning recipes. When we think of canning, we often think of really big batches of, hundreds of jars, but that's not necessarily the case. So even in the case that you don't want to make too much, canning is definitely something you can try out. It's not off limits. Here, I'm using my bubble remover again to remove any bubbles that might be left in our jam. Tapping my jar to remove any extra bubbles, just in case. Wiping down our rim. Adding my lid. And our screw band. And in it goes. This is going to process for 10 minutes in the canner. And now it's ready to come out and cool along with our other jars. Once they've cooled, you're going to check for a seal, which we went over in videos 1 and 2. And as always, don't forget to label your jars for safe storage. And this brings us to the end of our 3-part Urban Harvest home preservation series. I hope you found these videos useful and that they were a good learning experience for you as you explored the world of home canning and preservation.